Mind and Matter by G. F. Stout. Book 2. The Psychophysical Problem. Chapter 2. Interactionism, Parallelism, and Materialism. 1. Considered as scientific theories. It is the distinctive function of physical science to discover the order in which physical events take place according to a system of most general laws. It is for philosophy to consider whether the factors which science takes account of in fulfilling this task do or do not constitute all that really is. Now, the living bodies of men and animals form part of the physical world and have to be included in the general order of nature, which science investigates. But at this point, a new problem arises. How are the mental occurrences which enter into the life history of men and animals as experiencing individuals related to the physical order? Here, too, the question, so far as it is properly scientific, concerns the order of events, and not the full nature of concrete reality. From this point of view, there are three main alternatives. 1. That antecedent events, which are purely mental, contribute to determine the course of bodily and, most directly, of nervous processes, so that this is different from what it would be if only physical conditions were operative, and inversely, that antecedent events, which are purely physical, neural, in like manner, determine the course of mental processes. This is the theory of interactionism. It presupposes the mutually independent existence of mind and matter. 2. This is also presupposed in parallelism when it is strictly conceived, and not confused with materialism. According to the parallelist, mental process and nervous process go on together and very concomitantly, but they do not interact, and neither is dependent on the other for its existence. In the phenomenal order, both mind and matter are taken as ultimate. 3. The materialist, on the contrary, denies the independent existence of mind. He insists that mental process regularly occur when and only when certain complex physical processes take place in living organisms. They begin, continue, cease, and vary in their nature with the beginning, continuance, discontinuance, and variation of the physical processes. These, on the contrary, are fully accounted for by physical antecedents, by the previous and simultaneous course of events in the physical world, as traceable by the methods of science. Hence, the materialist, taking the scientific point of view as ultimate and adequate, is bound to affirm that in some way matter produces mind. 2. Considered as metaphysical theories. Each of these scientific theories becomes metaphysical when it is taken to express the whole truth, when, in other words, the conditions which suffice to determine the order of events according to rules of sequence and coexistence are assumed to be the only conditions which really exist and are really operative. Interactionism becomes metaphysical if it is assumed that mere interaction of itself absolutely constitutes the sole essential connection between bodily and mental process. Parallelism becomes metaphysical when the same assumption is made for the factual concomitance and covariation of mental occurrences and certain neural occurrences. Materialism becomes metaphysical if it is taken for granted that certain physical processes in living organisms are not only uniformly followed or accompanied by the existence of mind, but absolutely and of themselves produce or generate it. The man of science, while admitting that there may be other indispensable factors that those which come within the ken of science may avoid committing himself to any positive metaphysics by denying that there is any possible way of knowing what they are. But, even so, he is still taking up a philosophical position, that of agnosticism or skepticism. 3. The attitude of common sense. When hardened into metaphysical doctrines, none of these alternative views will appear in the sequel can be regarded as consistent with common sense. On the other hand, if they are considered merely as scientific hypotheses, common sense is not irreconcilably opposed to any of them. This is frequently denied. It is often asserted that the action of mere body on mere mind, and of mere mind on mere body, is prima facie a part of ordinary experience. It is regarded as prima facie a fact of ordinary experience that the body acts on the mind in sensation, and the mind on the body in volition. Is this so? If we mean by body mere body, and by mind mere mind, let us first consider sensation. Quote, if someone sticks a pin into me, and I feel a painful sensation, it seems obvious, end quote, says Mr. C.D. Broad, quote, that the entry of the pin into my body is the cause of the sensation in my mind, end quote. Footnote. The Monist, April 1918, page 234. Confer The Mind and Its Place in Nature, page 96. End footnote. In this statement, there is a twofold equivocation. The term mind is ambiguous, and so is the term cause. When I am aware of myself as feeling the painful sensation, the self of which I am aware is not pure mind, but the union of mind and body in the embodied self. It is therefore not obvious that the sensation is an effect produced merely in the mind. I do not, however, here insist on this point, as it is foreign to the scientific outlook. The standpoint of science being that of the external spectator, the body as present to the primary self-consciousness of the experiencing individual is, for it, included under the vague phrase mental phenomena. There remains the ambiguity of the term cause. Certainly, in ordinary language, the entry of the pin into the body would be called the cause of the painful sensation. But this does not mean that it is the sole condition in the phenomenal order which is required to secure the occurrence of the sensation. The meaning is rather that, other conditions being taken for granted, as they usually may, the entry of the pin makes the difference between the occurrence or non-occurrence of the event of which it is therefore said to be the cause. Common sense is quite prepared to learn without surprise that a multitude of other conditions and of intermediate processes is required in order to secure the occurrence of the sensation. Further, it is quite prepared to learn that it has a very inadequate view of the event which it calls the entry of the pin. This may include much that is hidden from it and inaccessible to it. The deficiencies of pre-scientific knowledge of the conditions of sensation have been, partly at least, supplied by science. It has been shown that the entry of the pin, if it is to give rise to sensation, includes action on a special sense organ, and that the change in the sense organ must be followed by a successive series of complex transactions within the body, leading up to a certain brain event. It is only when this brain event occurs that the sensation occurs. Now, the issue between the theories of interaction, parallelism, and materialism concerns only the relation between this brain event and the sensation. But the common sense belief is simply irrelevant to this question, which it never raises at all. It is compatible with all three views. According to the advocates of interaction, the cerebral occurrence causally conditions the sensation by acting on something called a mind. Hence, the pinprick, which initiates the train of occurrences terminating in the brain event, is only a remote causal condition of the sensation. According to the materialist, the brain event conditions the resulting sensation. According to the parallelist, the brain event does not cause the sensation either by itself or by acting on a mind. Sensation and brain event are so connected that neither can exist without the simultaneous existence of the other. Thus, the pinprick is a causal condition of the sensation and, at the same time, of the brain event, which cannot exist without it. Thus, parallelism in no way contradicts the common sense belief that the entry of a pin into my body under ordinary circumstances causes a painful experience. It merely adds that, in doing so, it must coincidentally affect my brain. Similarly, parallelism in no way contradicts the common sense belief that my volition to move my arm is causally connected with the ensuing movement. The disagreement with the advocates of interaction concerns only the way in which the volition acts. On neither view can the volition be regarded as by itself the complete cause of the train of events within the body which leads up to the movement. Both are bound to admit that the existing state of the brain at the time when the mental event is occurring plays a very important part. But at this point they diverge. The interactionist asserts that the volition by itself, as a purely mental event, acts on the brain so as to produce a change in it, which, so far as it is due to the will, is not causally dependent on any material antecedents, but purely on this mental antecedent. The parallelist asserts that the mental event is so connected with a concomitant brain process that both act together. They act together in such a way that, from the ordinary point of view of empirical science, it is impossible to refer part of the effect to the one and part to the other. Neither acts on the other or produces the other, but both are so connected that neither can exist without the other, and neither can vary in any manner or degree independently of the other. Hence, any variation in the effect traceable to a variation in the mental occurrence is also traceable to a corresponding variation in the brain occurrence, and inversely. Materialism is rarely put forward as a purely scientific view. It is nearly always, consciously or unconsciously, transformed into a metaphysical speculation. But if we strictly confine it within the limits of science, there is, so far as regards the present issue, no essential difference between it and parallelism. There is indeed a difference, which is important for philosophy as well as for science. This difference, however, does not concern the facts, but only the proper way of describing them. The materialist says that mind is entirely a product of matter. The parallelist objects that such language involves a use of the word production, otherwise foreign to science. Interaction being excluded, there is no question of material occurrence producing an effect in something else which is not material. The only other scientific sense in which the term produce can be employed with a definite and distinctive import is that in which, e.g., oxygen and hydrogen combine to produce water. Here, the product is an outcome of the conditions which produced it. It is these conditions themselves redistributed and modified by their interaction with each other. In this sense, a preceding state of the brain may and does contribute to produce a succeeding state. But the brain process does not in this way produce the mental process which accompanies it, and varies concomitantly with it. The materialist ignores this distinction, or treats it as unimportant. What is important for him is that in the phenomenal order, mental process begins, continues, changes, and ceases only with the beginning, continuance, change, and cessation of certain special processes in the physical world, which are themselves phenomenally traceable only to physical conditions. The parallelist does not deny this. On the contrary, it is the last word of science for him, as well as for the scientific materialist. Neither of them is bound to take the last word of science as absolutely the last word. If the scientific materialist is content to regard the scientific view as a relatively incomplete and superficial account of what really exists and takes place, he need have no quarrel with the position of common sense, that we determine the course of events in the physical world by our voluntary initiative. This belief may be, and presumably is, adequately grounded in an experience which physical science ignores. Nonetheless, it must be admitted that it is very difficult to keep materialism within its limits. Why insist that mind does not merely accompany certain physical conditions, but is produced by them, unless produce is used in a metaphysical sense? As a matter of fact, those who have called themselves materialists have, in general, maintained as ultimate truth that mind is absolutely created by merely material conditions. Metaphysical materialism is incompatible with any action of body on mind, or of mind on body. The only causal relation which it recognizes is the production or generation of mind, and of whatever is mental, by merely bodily factors. But A, in producing B, cannot act on or be acted on by B. B, in order to act or be acted on, must first exist. But it does not exist until it is called into existence by A. Oxygen and hydrogen, in combining to produce water, do not and cannot act on the very water they themselves produce. For until it is produced, the water is not there to be acted on. Pure materialism, therefore, plainly contradicts the belief that my volition to move my arm causally conditions the voluntary movement. The brain event, which generates the volition, is also the sole cause of what follows in my body. The materialist may say that though primarily mind and mental occurrences are produced by purely bodily conditions, yet when they have once come into being, they may interact with the body. It is thus possible for a volition causally to condition a bodily movement. But this kind of causality, even if it is possible, is incompatible with the common sense belief. It is incompatible with common sense to regard the agency of mind as merely that of a tool or instrument of something non-mental, as it is to deny it altogether. A fortiori, it is incompatible with common sense to regard the mental agency as merely a continuation of the agency of matter. Yet, on the materialist hypothesis, this must be so, for, according to it, the whole being of the volition, like that of other mental occurrences, is created out of nothing by bodily processes. Its agency must, therefore, be wholly and absolutely dependent on the material conditions which give it being. it can have no agency which is not merely a further development of this agency. 4. Interaction and parallelism are not genuine alternatives to materialism. Taken merely as scientific accounts of the connection of nervous process and mental process, both interactionism and parallelism fail signally to cover the empirical facts on which the materialist relies. If matter and mind are to interact, they must both pre-exist. Neither can act or be acted on before they exist. Now, there is a very large and impressive group of facts which seem to show that mental occurrences only come into being and only continue in being in dependence on material conditions. They seem not merely to be modified by material processes, but, in the phenomenal order, to owe their very existence to them. The broad facts are familiar and obvious in ordinary experience, though we are too often tempted to ignore them instead of fairly facing them. Conscious life in men and animals appears to begin only with the birth and growth of their bodies. When the body dies, it seems to cease altogether. It is suspended for a time under the influence of chloroform, or in consequence of a blow on the head. In the successive stages of drunkenness, mental processes gradually diminish in intensity and complexity, until at length complete torpor is reached. Science adds a vast body of evidence pointing in the same direction. I need only refer in general to the facts of mental pathology, e.g., to what happens when the secretion of the thyroid gland is defective. If we consider such facts in their whole range and variety, it must be admitted that they lend very strong support to scientific materialism. Indeed, they would almost compel us to accept it as a philosophical theory if there were not very cogent reasons against it. There seems to be no evidence of the existence of mind or of anything mental until certain special events take place in certain special parts of living organisms. When these events occur, mind begins. When they cease for a time or permanently, mind appears to cease for a time or permanently. And the varying natures of the minds which arise seems, so far as our knowledge extends, to be determined by the varying nature of the material conditions, e.g., by heredity and biological variation. Further, it is not only mind in general, but all the various processes and factors included in mental life, which depend for their existence, severally and in detail, on nervous processes. They are abolished when their material conditions cease, begin when these begin, and continue only when these continue. At least this holds good, so far as our evidence extends, and the evidence is wide enough and varied enough to justify a strong presumption that it holds good generally. It is plain that the ordinary theory of interaction between body and mind cannot cover this class of facts without further far-reaching assumptions. It simply presupposes minds as already existing and does not consider at all the conditions of their origin, continuance, and cessation. It offers no alternative to materialism, and yet materialism, if accepted, would be fatal to its claims, even as an account of what takes place when an experiencing individual is already beginning. All the ordinary arguments for interaction lose their force if we begin by accepting materialism. If a sensation is created by material processes, then whatever modifies these processes will modify the sensation or cause it to cease altogether. It is quite superfluous to assume direct action of the material occurrences on sentience. Similarly, the argument from the common sense belief in voluntary agency can no longer be urged. This belief must be illusory if the will itself is absolutely dependent on material conditions, so that action is merely that of the material conditions acting through it as an intermediate stage. It is futile to urge the absurdities which follow from the view that intelligent purpose and human interests in general do not count at all as factors working in the direction of their own fulfillment. For, according to Materialist, both intelligent purpose and its fulfillment are ultimately the outcome of material occurrences working blindly. To suppose that the material occurrences are capable of producing felt wants and desires, but are incapable of working towards their fulfillment, is to strain at a gnat and swallow a camel. Interaction, then, offers no real alternative to materialism. Does it fare any better with parallelism? It certainly does not, if the theory is regarded merely as an account of the relation of mind and body, without further assumptions. So limited, all that the parallelist asserts is that mental occurrences are inseparably associated with certain bodily processes, and vary concomitantly with them, but without interaction, or any kind of causal dependence. In denying interaction, he is at one with the materialist. But if he is not himself, as he often is, a materialist in disguise, he refuses to admit that the organic processes produce the mental processes with which they are connected. In this, however, he seems to be doing violence to the facts which he himself admits. He admits that conscious life arises only when certain material events occur, ceases when these cease, and, throughout its course, varies concomitantly with them. He cannot, without absurdity, say that at a certain stage in the course of nature, conscious life spontaneously begins to be, and spontaneously associates itself with a certain series of material processes, e.g., in the brain of man. Yet, what else can he say if he does not acknowledge that the material processes produce the mental? If he cannot bring himself to admit this, he must plainly make further assumptions. He may hold that both matter and mind have their source in something that is neither, but is in its own nature unknowable. This is the so-called double aspect theory. According to it, mind and matter are different sides or aspects of the same thing. We may dismiss it as untenable for the following reason. It is put forward and can claim acceptance only on the assumption that there are cogent grounds for rejecting the alternative view of the materialist. Now, as I shall attempt to show in the sequel, there really are such grounds. But when we come to examine what they are, we shall find that so far as they are valid at all, they forbid us, quite generally, to regard mind as arising from anything which is not mind. It makes no difference whether this is supposed to be material or immaterial, or whether it is supposed to be knowable or unknowable. There is ultimately no ground for denying that matter can produce mind, which is not equally a ground for denying that anything whatever which is totally unconscious can produce what is conscious in the widest sense of the word conscious. The difficulty lies in the supposed emergence of anything akin to sentience, feeling, thought, or experience from what is totally devoid of any kind or degree of sentience, feeling, thought, or experience. Thus, so far as regards our present problem, material existence may be regarded as synonymous with non-mental existence, and non-mental existence as synonymous with unconscious existence. Thus, if materialism is rejected, the beginning of mind must always be referred to pre-existing mind. Now, the philosophical parallelist, when his parallelism is not merely a disguised materialism, sees this quite clearly. Hence, if he is to be consistent, he must take a bold step and assume that material and mental occurrences are somehow correlated with each other, not only in men and animals, but everywhere throughout the universe. This step seems logically almost inevitable, if on the one hand we reject materialism, and if on the other we insist on facing the problem which materialism raises.